US President Joe Biden is here in Berlin holding talks with Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Biden met with Scholz at the Chancellery on what's expected to be his final visit before leaving office in January. Later, the two will be joined by the leaders of France and the UK. Their talks are expected to focus on the Middle East and Western support for Ukraine in its war against Russia.
Mr. President,
from the very beginning of the war, we closely coordinated ourselves across the Atlantic. It has made us strong, it has made the alliance strong, and we will continue to do that. Our position is clear. We continue to support Ukraine as strongly as possible. At the same time, we are making sure that NATO does not become a party to this war, so that this war does not lead to an even bigger catastrophe. We are very much aware of this responsibility, and no one can shoulder this responsibility for us. Of course, the situation in the Middle East is also on our agenda. The barbaric terrorist attacks of Hamas on Israel of October 7th has massively destabilized the situation. Israel has the right to defend itself. It is important to me to say this very clearly. We stand by Israel's side, and we fully agree that it is now more important than ever before to prevent further escalation and a regional conflagration.
Our charge is to make sure that the forces holding our societies together and binding us in the common cause of human dignity and freedom remain stronger than the forces seeking to pull us apart. And finally, Chancellor, I deeply appreciate your partnership and the many times you've forsaken the easy choice to make the right choice. Your act of statesmanship and friendship has made possible a safe return of unjustly detained Americans and Germans and the reunion of brave Russian dissidents to their families. I want to thank you. I value our conversations, and I look forward to them, this one is particularly. And I really mean it. I want to thank you for your friendship, not only personally, but I don't see how we maintain stability in Europe and around the world without a tight German-U.S. relationship. And you're the leader to do it. Thank you.
Let's bring in DW's political correspondent Matthew Moore, who's standing by for us outside the Chancellery here in Berlin. Matthew, good to see you again. So what is your main takeaway from Biden's visit so far?
Well, they talked about unity and friendship, and I think that goes for their relationship with one another. I think they hold each other in the highest regard. And I think it also goes for the relationship between USA and Germany, especially under their administrations in recent years. And basically the message of this farewell is that Germany and US have a very important relationship, not just for each other, but also for peace in Europe, and that relationship needs to sustain into the future. And Biden was at pains to make the case that they have unwavering support for Ukraine. And he said that Western allies must sustain our support until Ukraine wins a just and sustainable peace. And that was the message. He referred to the winter that's coming, a cold winter ahead for Ukraine. And I think that will be the focus of the rest of the day as well, as they talk with other European leaders. But fundamentally, this was about setting the tone for their relationship going forward, because we know that there are US elections coming up where we could have a President Trump or a President Harris, and that will really hail a new era in the relationship. But I think this was two men standing side by side today, saying that they are very closely together on the big issues of our times, and that they hope that it continues to be the case.
And that issue of Ukraine, which you've mentioned just there, will be playing a big part in the rest of today's agenda. Tell us more, Matthew.
Yeah, that's right. There's a meeting of the Quad. That is the US President, the Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and French President Emmanuel Macron, along with the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And on the agenda will be the victory plan that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been presenting around Europe in recent weeks. And one of those things is about an immediate invitation to eventually join NATO. So that will be on the agenda. They'll also be talking about the use of long-range missiles to strike targets deep into Russia. Ukraine would like any conditions on that to be removed completely, But again, these talks will be behind closed doors, and we don't expect there to be a communiqué afterwards. So we're not going to know what was agreed. But fundamentally, I think it will be aligning themselves, making sure that they are agreed on the big issues that can pave the way for Ukraine to get that just peace that they so desperately want. Another issue that will be on the agenda will be the Middle East. There is a sense among G7 NATO leaders that the killing of Yahya Sinwar could pave the way to ramp up efforts to broker a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. So we wait to find out what, if anything, we will learn from the meeting of the Quad, but that takes place later in the afternoon.
Thanks, Matt. We'll leave it there. DW's political correspondent Matthew Moore joining us from outside the Chancellery here in Berlin.
Germany's highest honour for Germany's most important ally. President Steinmeier handed the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit to President Biden, praising him as a beacon of democracy.
This award means so much to me for what it says about us.
Soon it was on to the Chancellery. Olaf Scholz eager to welcome Biden on what is likely to be the 81-year-old president's last visit to Berlin while in office.
Dear Joe, thanks again for taking the time for this visit. It is a strong signal of our transatlantic unity and of our friendship.
Biden stressed how closely he had worked with Germany during his time in the White House and thanked Scholz for the decision to boost spending on defence.
Our alliance with Germany extends far beyond Ukraine and Europe. It's global.
The two leaders reiterated support for Ukraine, their countries the number 1 and 2 when it comes to sending military aid to Kyiv.
As Ukraine faces a tough winter, we must sustain our resolve, our effort, and our support. And I know the cost is heavy, but make no mistake, it pales in comparison to the cost of living in a world where aggression prevails.
We are supporting Ukraine as strongly as possible. At the same time, we're ensuring that NATO does not become a party to the war. This visit, in fact President Biden's first bilateral trip to Germany, was part thank you and part farewell. But it was a working trip too. The French President and the British Prime Minister both also in Berlin for four-way talks focusing on the war in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East. In both cases, as the era of President Biden draws to a close, the world is still searching for a pathway to peace.
Well, for more analysis, let's bring in Rachel Tausenfreund, who is a US and transatlantic analyst with the German Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for joining us today on DW News. So the transatlantic part of all of this is Germany, is Europe about to lose its best ever partner in the White House?
I mean, I think there can be no doubt that Joe Biden will go down as one of the best U.S. president partners for Europe. I mean, the support for the Ukraine war and the steadfast U.S. leadership and its ability to work closely and make things possible with European partners that many would have doubted is absolutely one of the strongest elements of Biden's legacy. And I think that's part of the reason he wants to kind of underscore and solidify that in his final months.
Now, can Europe stand up to Russia and China without Joe Biden and the United States, as is the concern that if Donald Trump wins the election in just a few weeks' time and he regains the White House?
I mean, the short answer is no. The Europe simply lacks the military capacity it would need to be a kind of the kind of military support actor that Ukraine would need, right? There are certain capabilities that Europe doesn't have and can't fill the gap that could be left by the United States. And they would have needed to start a few years ago to be ready for a drop in U.S. support in January. That said, the EU has made progress, and maybe they could become able to deal more autonomously with Russia or China in a couple of years' time.
Now, of course, former President Donald Trump is going head-to-head with the current Vice President, Kamala Harris. How do you see, if Harris wins, how do you see relations developing or maintaining between the US and Europe?
I think there's every reason to think that also a Harris administration would have a really solid relationship with the European partners. I mean, Harris wasn't necessarily a foreign policy vice president. It hasn't been a focus of her career, but a vice president is a big part of the foreign policy of an administration. And this foreign policy was very much shaped by interactions with Europeans and the Ukraine war as a centerpiece. So I think Harris, however she started a few years ago, is now probably much more European than she was, and has built relationships, is engaged in all of the central issues, and I think it's going to be a strong relationship.
Right. Well, no matter who wins, of course, we have just a few weeks to wait until that election takes place on November 5th. How does Germany and Europe make its best case to ensure the United States continues providing security?
I mean, the case will vary a little depending on who's in the White House, but the fundamentals remain the same, which is Europe needs to present itself as a strong and strategic thinking partner, which is to say, you know, we understand that we need to increase our capacity. We're going to do that in coordination with the United States and NATO to ensure, you know, maximum capacity overlap between the EU and NATO. But we understand we have to do more, and here's our plan to get there. That's the main part. The EU has to present itself as an organization and as a group of people with ideas and with momentum.
Yeah, I feel there'll be plenty to talk about on this topic in the coming weeks and months and years even. We'll leave it there. Rachel Tausenfreund with the German Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for joining us today on DW News.
Thank you.
We continue that story now. I'm joined by Cathryn Clüver-Ashbrook. She is an executive vice president at the Bertelsmann Foundation, which is a think tank here in Berlin focusing on transatlantic relations. It's good to have you with us on this Friday evening. This was Joe Biden's possibly last visit to Europe as U.S. president. He just has a few months left in office. The media today called him the last transatlanticist. Are we at a turning point? Are we at an inflection point in U.S.-Europe relations with his departure?
Well, first of all, Brent, it's great to be with you. We're at the end of an era, and that is unmistakable. Joe Biden was profoundly shaped in his long-standing commitment to Europe, to the strength of the European Union, to the functionality of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, by a post-war American future, by a meaning of Pax Americana. And now, regardless of who wins the election on and after November 5th, there's either a new generation moving into the White House, someone who's very focused on the challenges in Asia Pacific, rightly so. Those are the imminent challenges to American leadership, or by someone who fundamentally wants to see more chaos in the international system and might actually make it easier for America's systemic rivals to have their moment in the history books. So it is certainly an end of a very specific transatlantic era. Not to say that there might not be a new chapter written in this German-American friendship. Of course there will be, but it will be a different one.
You know, Biden has been sharply criticized for a policy of failure in terms of getting Israel to say yes to a ceasefire in Gaza. But when it comes to Europe, the criticisms have been more nuanced and certainly not as loud. I mean, what do you see as Biden's legacy in the relationship with Europe?
Well, I think John Kirby, in his press spray earlier today, made it very clear and reiterated the president's points, this idea that Vladimir Putin aimed with his imperial objectives to take over not only Ukraine in full, but to split NATO down the middle, to rupture the unity of the European alliance, effectively, and the European part of the alliance. And in that regard, Putin has not achieved any of his objectives. In fact, under American leadership and with American leadership, NATO has grown stronger. It's grown stronger by 2 members. Joe Biden and his administration are the people who convened the Ramstein format, which effectively now, with a new command structure in Wiesbaden that will be underwritten by NATO, has grown effectively institutional legs that will carry beyond a presidential election. So no matter who is in the White House, there will be ways for a European pillar in NATO to coordinate more strongly. And fundamentally, every member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has stepped up its defense spending, has stepped up its commitment to creating allied defense and deterrence deterrence within Europe. And Joe Biden would say of himself and his own legacy, that is at least in part due to American leadership represented by Joe Biden.
The fact that there was no one representing any Eastern European countries here in Berlin today to, bid farewell to Biden, do you think that's going to leave a bitter aftertaste once he's gone and once, Eastern Europeans begin looking at a new president and a new U.S. administration?
Well, I do think that was a complete strategic oversight, by the way. Donald Tusk should have been at the Quad meeting. It should have been a meeting of the five, if you will, because Poland will play and is already playing an outsized role rightly in the fundamental anchoring of Ukraine's security. GDP 4% into their own defense, which strengthens NATO. And then, of course, if a president is Donald Trump, after November 5th's election, then Donald Trump has a greater predilection, and we saw that with his threats to withdraw troops from Germany and potentially place them in Poland. Poland has historically a strong ear in a Donald Trump administration, but could play a vital role in securing American troops' continuing presence on European soil. And so in all of those strategic ambiguities in which we find ourselves right now, at the very least, Donald Tusk should have been at the table.
Yeah. Cathryn Clüver-Ashbrook with the Bertelsmann Foundation. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, for more, I'm joined now by Charles Kupchan. He's an expert on U.S. foreign policy at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Mr. Kupchan, it's good to have you back on the program. This was more than just a visit for President Joe Biden. It was a chance to say farewell and to lay out his hopes for the future. I want to get your opinion. Are we at a turning point in U.S.-European relations with the departure of Joe Biden?
I think we don't know the answer to that question because we don't know who's going to win the November election here in the United States. I also think that there is a durability, a resilience to the transatlantic relationship that we have seen over the last 25 years since the Cold War ended, and that would likely withstand even Donald Trump's re-election, who, as we know, is no big fan of Europe, the European Union, the NATO alliance. But I think we live in a world now in which, because of China, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States and Europe are going to stay attached to each other. They remain each other's best partners. I think that will be the case even after Joe Biden and even if Donald Trump is the next American president.
I'd like to highlight something from an article in the German newspaper Die Zeit that came out this week, and I didn't get your reaction to it. I want to pull up an excerpt from the article. It reads, "The visit of Biden is a farewell visit, and it is a break. Joe Biden is the last passionate transatlanticist leader of the United States. He is the elder statesman of the West. And it is not clear what will happen to the West when he leaves. What is clear is that it will never again be the way it has been with him." So let me ask you, what will Joe Biden's transatlantic legacy be?
Well, I to some extent agree with that quote in the sense that Biden is the end of a generation. Biden has Atlanticism and transatlantic unity in his bloodstream, in part because he grew up and entered politics after World War II during the Cold War. He, in many respects, has been living and breathing NATO. I worked for President Obama. I think I went to Ukraine with Vice President Biden 6 times when he was vice president. To get a vice president who cares that much about European security, those days are probably behind us. But as I said, I do think there is a durability here to the relationship that will withstand the passing of that older generation of Atlanticists. And I think to some extent, we've already seen that. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, they did not enter office as Atlanticists in the same way that Biden did. They ended up Atlanticists mainly because when they needed help in the world, Europe was the best place to get it.
Yeah, if we go back to the Obama administration, you remember just as well as we do that President Obama talked about this pivot to Asia, and that sent off a lot of alarm bells here in Europe. Do you think that the Europeans maybe are prone to being paranoid or overreacting when there is a transition taking place in the United States, fearing that they may be on the negative end of that change?
Will there be over time a pivot to the Indo-Pacific for the United States? Yes. And that's because China is the pacing challenge of the 21st century. It will rivet American decision makers for the next couple of decades, if not longer. That having been said, I think that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was a wake-up call for the Europeans. Let's keep in mind that Europe has been pushing Biden on tanks, on F-16s, on strikes against Russian territory. That's new. It was always the United States that was pushing Europe. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that we're in a new era in which Europe is to some extent stepping up to the plate, ready to assume more responsibility for its own defense, including Germany, where we have seen a change in German defense spending, German readiness to send arms to Ukraine. That's all good because it means that Europe will be stronger at a time when the United States will need to put more emphasis and more resources into the Indo-Pacific.
That readiness here in Europe that you're talking about, that also includes Eastern European countries, particularly Poland. And I mentioned that because at today's meeting here in Berlin, there was no representative from any East European country invited to be with President Biden to bid farewell. What do you make of that? Do you think that was a mistake?
I do think it was a mistake. I think it was, to some extent, a reflection of the old world, a reflection of old Europe. The Quad, the US, the Brits, the French, the Germans, that's a formula that has been meeting now for decades, and it works well because it puts at the table the key players. But Europe has changed. Europe has moved to the east. The Brits have left the EU. I do think it would have made sense to have the Poles, maybe the Italians, maybe a Baltic country at the table. And I'm guessing that, yes, we are at that inflection point historically where moving forward, we will see a different configuration when it comes to U.S. diplomacy with Europe.
And there are reports this week, we heard them from the Ukrainian president, that there could be tens of thousands of North Korean troops preparing to join Russian forces in Russia's campaign against Ukraine. Now, that, of course, would increase the stakes of this war. The Ukrainian president said that would put us on a path to a world war. If we do have a North Korean ingredient, though, in this conflict, do you think that Europe is prepared? Does it have the defense with it all to deal with it without the umbrella or without the guidance of a strong U.S. administration?
Well, I think that the U.S. is prepared to continue supporting Ukraine to ensure its self-defense. I don't think the arrival of some North Korean troops would be a game changer. Quite honestly, I'm skeptical that you're going to see North Korea suddenly show up in Donbass fighting Ukrainian soldiers. Yes, the North Koreans are sending arms to Russia. The Iranians are sending arms to Russia. But actually entering that war, I'm skeptical that that's going to happen. But we need to face the reality here in the United States and in Europe that whether or not we get a ceasefire in Ukraine, the country is going to need our support for the foreseeable future. The only way to make sure that Russia doesn't keep coming or try this again is to give Ukraine the economic and military capability that it needs to defend itself. That's going to be a long-term commitment.
Charles Kupchan from the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Kupchan, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights on this Friday night. Thank you.
Good to be with you. Good night.